Hey, welcome back. Thank you so much for taking some time with that last video. I know that one was a little bit longer. I promise the other two won't be that long, but I felt like I just needed to put all that thinking into one video for you. Well, when we begin to think about this a bit further, I want to just talk about this idea of faithing and faithing communities and what's I see sort of going on here, which I think is sort of interesting. I've already shown you this chart. I'm not going to reiterate it again, but you can see that there's a lot going on in our faithing communities, right? There's not just one type of person that believes in Jesus. We're believing, meaning making, discovering, faithing in multiple ways, in multiple developmental forms that has a huge effect on the ways that we think about the ways we teach and learn and communicate and actually think about serving one another. And with that in mind, I think I just want to remind you again that this faithing trajectory is something that's ongoing, moving, changing. We've talked about that before as we've moved from sort of the teenager years, especially in what we're talking about, into sort of this younger to emerging or older emerging adulthood, right? There are things that are more particular in what we talked about last time that I think are really, really crucial. Now, when we think about this, though, I think sometimes if you were to stop and think about faith and faithing for a second, and I maybe, even in the way I communicated, it might have come across this way, we can think of the faithing journey simply as intellectual. And maybe you've done this, like, right? Like someone comes up to you and they say, I'm really, really struggling. And instantly we're like, you know what? I've got a podcast for you. I've got a book for you. I've got an article for you. I got a verse for you, right? Do you notice what we do? We often default to thinking that when someone has a sense of doubt or a questioning as part of their faithing journey, that it's an intellectual problem. And an intellectual problem needs an intellectual fix because we assume that right thinking brings about right living. Now, there's part of that is absolutely true. There certainly is an intellectual perspective, and that's part of it. But that's the key. Like the intellectual part of faithing is only part of it. We know from research that there also is an emotional component to faithing. How we feel, how we work through guilt and shame, how we are impacted by faithing and doubting and working through that. We'll talk more about this a bit later, but it has a dramatic effect on the ways that we make sense of the world because sometimes the problem isn't necessarily that I have an intellectual problem. The problem might be because it'd be something about my sense of fear or my sense of shame or my sense of something going on in my life. And so we have to pay attention to this emotional component that's a part of faithing. And then there's actually a relational component as well, right? The way that we think about faithing isn't just individualistic, but it has a relational part and piece that's really, really crucial. You could even see glimmers of that in what I shared in the last video about the ways that we construct our faith, right? Who we're with, who the authority figure is, who we trust, who we don't trust anymore, all have a dramatic effect on the ways that our faithing trajectory is impacted. So this intellectual, emotional, relational triad is constantly in play. And Daniel Sparks talks about this in the book, right? She talks about this idea of knowing, dependence, and community, right? And these factors shape the ways that we think about our faith and faithing journey. Now, let me just muse on this for a second and think about our faithing communities for a second. And I'm going to talk about two categories, right? Rather than the big chart that I showed you before. I just want you to think about it this way. That there are people in our churches in particular or ministries or whatever, but mostly churches. Let's think about this. That many are faithful members. Okay, they probably fall more in a loyalist sort of category. They've been around the church for a long time. They really care about their community. And if we think about it through the lenses of the intellectual, emotional, relational components of faithing, they would probably say the faithful members were like, look, we are here and we believe in this truth because everyone in our community believes it. We have like a belief statement on our website. We kind of have an operating assumption that when we walk through the doors that there's a language that we speak, there's a perspective that we take, there's a way that we think the world works that we're trying to encourage or challenge or heal or whatever it might come with it, right? Now, emotionally, think about what this does for a faithful member. There's a lot of assurance that comes from being in a place like this. Like I can step into this place where I trust other people. I can be encouraged that maybe I got beat up all week and I finally am at a place where I'm with people that sort of resonate with me again. And so that there's an assurance that I'm okay, that I'm safe, that I'm on the right path, all that comes with that. And so relationally as well, there's a sense of affirmation, right? It's not just a feeling that I have. I've got people praying for me. I've got people saying, don't give up. I've got people that say, we love you, right? There's this affirmation that's there as well. Now, think about what that does for faithful members. It makes them feel incredibly encouraged along the way. Now, there's some others in the church that let's call them faithful challengers. Now, notice that both categories people are faithful, which I think is really, really important, right? One group of people or another is not necessarily better or worse. They're not necessarily better lovers of Jesus or less. That's not the point. It's just the way that they're making sense of the world, right? So the faithful challengers are the ones that are oftentimes emerging adults that intellectually are like, I'm not sure I'm buying what the pastor said this morning. I'm not sure that assumption is true. Or maybe it's true for, some people, but certainly not people in my circle of friends or in my community. And so I'm not sure I believe that. Now think about that that does when one comes to, say, church and is thinking that emotionally, what we'll find is that there is this element of guilt and shame. Like, is there something wrong with me? How come uh, how come everyone seems to be okay with this, but I'm not? And I think relationally, what can happen, and we talked about this in the previous lecture as well. I think they can, what can be communicated to them. This is this element of suspicion by others, right? Um, like maybe there's something off about this person, or maybe this person needs a little extra prayer or encouragement, right, to get on the right track, right? Maybe they've lost their faith and we're trying to help them find it, right? So a faithful challenger is trying to find their way, but intellectually and emotionally and relationally, they oftentimes don't have the same experience as the faithful members. Now, let's think about this for a second. If you put faithful members and faithful challengers together in a community, what's going to happen? What we find often happening is sometimes the faithful members are trying to pull the faithful challengers back toward them, right? No, you don't want to do that. That sounds super liberal. Don't go that direction because we don't want you to be wayward. There's the slippery slope, right? Whatever language is often used is like they're trying to say, look, come back to what you knew before. Come back to the space. It's going to be okay. And the faithful challengers are trying to pull the faithful members along. You don't want to be on the wrong side of history. Don't you see that the gospel is bigger than that? I'm really, really worried that if you don't pay attention to the people in our community that you're missing, that we're going to become irrelevant and we are going to, and worse, maybe do damage and hurt to those that we don't see, right? So the faithful challengers are trying to sort of move the community forward in a faithful direction. So the tension between the faithful members and the faithful challengers can really light up oftentimes, right? Like you can feel it in your churches, and perhaps there's been conflicts that you've experienced as well. Now, we know that in many ways, what happens, and it's often faced with emerging adults, is that they're moving in a direction and they're thinking about being a faithful challenger. That's sort of how they're living their lives. But they kind of bump up to this point with faithful members. Like if they really want to be associated with this church, they almost have to ask the question, is it worth the challenge? Or maybe I just need to capitulate and become part of the status quo. And sometimes they're like, no, I've got to work through it because it's the only way I can make sense of my world and make sense of the faithing that I am working on. So this faithing journey is more than just sort of this individual thing that I'm working on, though that's a really crucial piece. It's more than just intellectual, it's emotional and relational as well. And it's embedded in a faith community where you've got people at different places pulling at each other in different ways that sometimes can be quite beautiful and sometimes can be filled with fireworks, right? So this idea of intergenerational ministry, this idea of like doing faith together is quite a challenge. And perhaps if we think about it through these developmental lenses, maybe that's part of the problem. So it seems to me, though, that if we're really going to be faithful in our churches, we just need to realize that if you're faithing and I'm faithing and we're doing that together, well, that's really where churching happens, right? Churching is this dynamic, changing, forming of us not only as individuals, but collectively as a church. And I think this is oftentimes where the challenge goes out to existing churches to think about what does it truly mean to engage emerging adults? If it's simply opening up a space in our community where they come in, but they don't necessarily change the status quo, I think there's going to be some um, emerging adults that aren't necessarily interested in that. And at the same time, how do emerging adults learn from one's elders and the history that has come their way as well? This is the work, the hard work of what it means to be a faith community together. So just some questions for you to think about. How does faithing and churching change one's views of intergenerational ministry? We know intergenerational ministry is pretty cool. Young people, old people working together. But when we think about it through this concept that we talked about today, what are the challenges associated with that? How does your view of faithing change intellectual elements um, uh, show to be important but incomplete, right? Like if we only think about the intellectual, might that have a limitation? Also, what patterns help or hurt churching? Where have you seen beautiful ways that people with different perspectives work together, and where has that also fallen short? And how might this reality of faithing impact how we recruit and lead volunteers, right? Like if everybody's at a different faithing place, how might this actually shape the way that we invite people in and serve together? Lots to think about here for sure, but I hope that perhaps an appreciation of the complexity and the nuance might give us a new sensitivity to what it might be going on, especially between emerging adults and the church, that might open up new possibilities and new creative avenues for us to think about this in our own context and our own ministries. So thanks for leaning in with me on this. I hope that this has been helpful to you. Peace.